This is Canada Reads American Style, featuring two friends who love Canada Reads and Canadian literature. Welcome our host Rebecca from Michigan and Tara from Ontario. Hi everyone, it is Rebecca, and today I am speaking with author Marion Agnew. Marion is a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen who moved north midlife after a career in technical writing and editing. Making Up the Gods, published by Latitude 46 in 2023, is her first novel. Her previous book, Reverberations, A Daughter's Meditations on Alzheimer's, published by Signature Editions in 2019, was shortlisted for the Louise de Kiriline Lawrence Award for Nonfiction. She lives on the Lake Superior shoreline, a grateful guest in Robinson's Superior Treaty Territory, home of the Anishinaabe, Fort William First Nation, and Metis peoples. Welcome, Marion.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Well, I just want everybody to know, I always give my full transparency here. I did receive a copy of Making Up the Gods from your publicist, and I loved it. And so, as I've often said, we don't interview people unless we absolutely love their book. So I'm so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you. I appreciate that you're so excited about this novel.
Yes, and I'm going to just say this like 12 times throughout the interview. Please, everyone, read this book. You will love it. I guarantee. Okay. Now, since there may be people out there who have yet to read it, can you tell us a bit about Making Up the Gods?
Sure. Making Up the Gods is set in present-day northwestern Ontario, just now north of Thunder Bay. And its main character is named Simone. She's a widow who's estranged from her family, and she's feeling a little bit stuck, but doesn't quite know how to get out of it. And then a stranger shows up at her door claiming to be her cousin about the same time that she's been kind of guilted into taking care of a young boy for a long weekend. And the story kind of unravels from there, or unfolds. I hope it doesn't unravel. And what happened? So it occurs in early May, late April, and in late January, before the action of the story starts, there was a traffic accident that has killed several people and injured others and affected the whole community. And so people in the novel are struggling with that as well.
When did you start writing the novel, and what prompted you to tell this story? Because I feel like there's a little bit of history where there have been some accidents in the past, some big, pretty significant accidents in Canada. So did your book come out as a result of that, or did you do that before all of those kinds of things happened?
I'm a slow writer, I guess. I started this in 2011, and it's my first novel that I finished even a draft of. And I liked it enough to keep writing it, if that tells you how long it takes. And that's well before a crash in Saskatchewan. There was one recently in Manitoba. There was a train derailment and fire in Quebec. And I would probably have not felt qualified to write about it if I hadn't already started and figured out how I wanted to treat the accident in my novel. It's really, I'm not a therapist. I'm just a writer. So I can't really begin to imagine what it's like for a community to lose an entire hockey team or a group of senior citizens. And so I put it in the background and didn't deal with a lot around the community's grief. I wanted to focus on individuals because that's where I felt a little more in my comfort zone, not quite so far out of my depth.
Well, I have to say, knowing those situations now, I thought you handled that community grief really beautifully, because I think you hit just the right amount of, I'm not even sure how to put it, but it was just the right amount in the story. But can you talk a little bit too about those three characters and how you maybe created those three characters?
Sure. I've known Simone for a while, and that's going to sound kind of woo-woo, but that is a little bit how writing works. Simone was one of the characters I wrote about in a short story a long time ago. It was finally published in 2015 in an anthology. And I was writing short stories when I began to do what I think of as my writing instead of technical writing for money. I was writing short nonfiction and short fiction to figure out how to work with characters and dialogue and scenes and plot and how that all even works. And Simone, they say to write what you know. And so one morning I was making toast and there was this voice at my elbow saying, "I crave butter." And I thought, oh, I know this person. I don't know how much I know of her yet, but I know her. And she had, at that time, had been widowed for a year. And so the short story was the story of her first year after her husband's death. And I loved the story. I loved how it came together. I loved spending time with her. And periodically after that, I finished work on it. I would wonder what's going on with her. And so when we had a visiting writer in town who was doing a workshop, and she said, "So everybody think of a story that you're going to write, a long novel." And I thought, if there's any one character I want to spend more time with, it's Simone. So I tried to figure out what she might be doing. And I had this vision of her standing ankle deep in Lake Superior with a little boy. And they were talking about trickster gods and why bad things happen to anybody. And the little kid said, if I got to be the one making up the gods, I wouldn't make trickster gods. I would have everything be predictable. And so once I had that scene and I had the phrase making up the gods, it was a matter of working backwards and working forwards and trying to figure out what the heck was going on that got them in that situation. And one of the things that got them in that situation was this stranger showing up at her door claiming to be her cousin, and that's Martin. So we then have Simone the widow, Chen, a 9-year-old boy, Chen short for Chenoweth, and Martin, who's from Southern Ontario.
I love that. First of all, I love when authors say that a character comes to them and that they live with them and they feel they know them so well. I just think those are such beautiful relationships from an artistic standpoint. I love that. Now, interestingly for me, and I've always wanted to ask an author this because I see this happen from time to time, but Simone and Chen's chapters are in first person and Martin's is in third. So how and why did you make that decision? So I realize you're kind of answering this question for all authors in which I've read this situation, but how is it for you that you selected first person and third person?
It's partly comfort, I think. And I mean, I could make myself maybe sound smarter than I am, but first person is one of those things where you're walking around in someone else's skin. Like you are the character. And it's really difficult if a first person character is not completely honest. It's difficult to keep that from the reader and have the reader not feel like they're being lied to. And so I was comfortable writing Simone in first person. And also she always was the main character. And so I wanted her to be as reliable as possible. Like if she was fooling the reader, she's fooling herself, not just withholding information. So that was part of it. And then Chen is a young boy and he's writing in a notebook because he's still seeing a therapist. His father and stepbrother were killed in the traffic accident in January. And so he's still seeing a counselor and talking about stories and talking about what's happening in his life. And so he's writing down keywords in a notebook, but he's very reflective. And so his voice was first person. And then in that same spirit of if you're reading a first person character and you are basically wearing their clothes or holding the camera, if you want to get less icky about it, Martin needed to be third person because I didn't know him as well, for one thing. But for another, we need to be a little bit suspicious of his motivation. Although he is fairly transparent, it's possible that there was stuff going on with him that we didn't know about. And so I wanted that little bit of distance between him and the other characters. And in a purely practical matter, I wanted, if somebody picked up the book after having, gone to bed the night before, or they had to stop and do something else, I wanted them to pretty well know what they were reading, like whose point of view, who's even talking to me. I wanted that to be fairly apparent to a reader who might be coming back to it after a little bit of a rest.
Oh, that's really good. No, that's very interesting because Martin is the character who whose motivations we don't fully understand from the beginning. So I love that that's kind of how you made that decision. Simone is surrounded by ghosts from her past with whom she converses. Now, Chen and Martin have ghosts, but in a different way. Can you talk about how these experiences differ?
Sure. So Simone has had a difficult time letting go of her husband. And so her losses, I mean, the ghosts that are around her are her husband, her mother, and her grandfather. And she never really knew her grandfather. Her mother has died years ago, and then her husband died only 5 years ago. So those are, but still, compared to Chen and even Martin's losses, those are relatively much more recent than her 5 years ago loss. And so the ghosts around her are less about who the person actually was and more about Simone's story about who the person was. Like, I mean, my parents passed away long ago. My mother died in 2000 and my dad in 2007. And so I no longer really have conversations with them, obviously. But when I think of what would mom say about this or what would daddy say about this, I don't know. All I know is what I might guess they might say. And those are the stories that Simone is telling herself. And those are kind of embodied in a spiritual way or spirit way in those ghosts. And Chen is still trying to figure out what it means for his father to be gone completely. I mean, death is really hard. It's hard for grownups. I can't imagine what it would be like for a 9-year-old. And then his stepbrother is the other person who died in the accident that he was connected to. And everybody's got mixed feelings about siblings. And this is no different from that. And so there's still, like, it's still kind of shocking to him, the practical changes that his stepbrother's death has brought. Like, all the socks are still in his stepbrother's drawer. And so he doesn't need to wash his socks more often. He can just go get one of Ryan's pairs of socks. And those are small things, but are big, I think, too, when you have a fresh loss. And Martin's trying to figure out if he can make it on his own without the comfort zone that he had as a recovering alcoholic and in a community. He's now in a different community. And what does that mean? And he's kind of spreading his wings and trying new things too.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about these three characters and the grief that they were kind of still processing and going through is that they found comfort in whatever they had to use to help them through that. And I think it's interesting because, in the story, Simone has ghosts, but the other two, they have ghosts as well. They just come in a different form for the character. But I think that's true about real life. I think we all process differently. And I think, because I had a friend one time when I was telling her a story about my dad had passed recently, and she just, after I told her this little story, it was sort of like, oh, well, that's what, that's good. That's comfort for you. That's what you need. And I thought she's kind of dismissing what I'm going through in a way. And I felt like, okay, yes, it is true. That is how I'm processing it. But I can still believe that, his like ghost or whatever came to me and gave me a message, and it's still okay. And I just sort of felt in that moment like, that's what I loved about your book, is that all three characters were handling it in the way that worked for them. And that's what grief is about, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've talked, surprisingly to me, the book does seem to be quite a bit about grief. I didn't really plan that, but I do think it's exactly perfectly okay to do whatever you need to do as long as you're not harming, somebody else or really harming yourself long term. But I know people who every time they see a penny think that's a message from their dad. Or, I mean, my dad was a birder, and so sometimes seeing a cardinal, I think about him. I think most grief counselors would say that just because someone's dead doesn't mean that your relationship is over.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what I agree with you. I don't think the story is fully about grief. I think it's about so many things, but I think because I'm going through that process right now myself, that's kind of what spoke to me. But yes, for everybody who's going to read this book, there are layers to it that are just so beautiful, and you will find what resonates most with you when you read it, because there are so many different layers to these three complex characters. And in fact, that's my next question. I'm going to lead right into it, which is that Simone as a complex character rings true, especially when she isn't behaving her best. She rang true for me as a real human being and not a character that's developed who has no flaws. And that is absolutely one of the things I loved most about this book. So can you talk a little bit about how you developed her personality?
Sure. One of my jokes is that I just looked in the mirror and there she was. It's not true, of course. I mean, Simone is braver than I have been. She's a little bit crabbier than I am, generally speaking. But I did want to make her very human, and I certainly have plenty of very human flaws, including making a joke that you think is funny and it's not. It turns out to be hurtful.
Mm-hmm.
That's really difficult. And she's afraid. Like, she doesn't want to give up what she's got, even though it's not completely satisfactory to her. Because what if something terrible happens? So she walks around in fear a lot. And I think we might all want change sometimes, but be afraid to make those changes or not really even know how. And, you ask someone if they want to get together for coffee or lunch and they say no, or they put you off and you feel dumb because you did it, and vulnerable, and it makes you a little bit crabby. And so those are the kinds of things I wanted to do with her. I didn't want to make her either a saintly, all-knowing, wise, elderly person, or like a stock character that's completely angry all the time, or that doesn't know how to have fun and doesn't know beauty, because I wanted it to be a three-dimensional story. It's about her continuing to make choices. Like, just because she's 69 doesn't mean that she's got to shuffle off the stage now. These are times when people can still choose new ways of being in the world or make decisions that change their lives and the lives of other people. They're still main characters in their own story. And I wanted her to be that, instead of relying necessarily on some happenstance, like a brand new neighbor moving in like next door, that would be the change she needed. Or I wanted her to take an active role.
And that's something you just said really hit me as well, which is, I don't know that we always see complex older women characters, because it's that old thing where they say, women are saying, like, when they got to a certain age, they were invisible, that whole thing. And I think in literature, sometimes it's either the crabby old lady next door or the saintly person who has never, who just lives her life in this air of perfection. And I think that's what I love about Simone, is she just feels so real to me. I've known women like her. I probably am a woman like her, now as I'm getting older. And so thank you for creating a character that I think can resonate for people of all ages, but especially for those of us who are older. She's just so real. And I thank you for writing her. I love her as well.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad she feels real to you, because I have to say, since the book's been published, it feels like my best friend moved away.
Yeah, that's what I wondered, because now that you've told her story, like you said, you wanted to find out where she is now and what she's doing. So now you've created that. So does it feel like a loss in a way then?
Yeah, I mean, it really does. It's wonderful to share her with readers, and that's the best part. But knowing that this part of her story is done, I mean, I can't be kind of daydreaming and think, oh, she has to remember to say something about this. I'm working on a new novel, and I'm trying to get that way with my new characters. But it does mean that this chapter in her life is closed. And I've started feeling this. It came out in October of 2023. And so the 6 months or so before it was coming out, I started to recognize that it was going to be kind of a turning point in my relationship with her. And it was kind of difficult. So, it's not that she's gone, but I sure do understand why people create more stories in the same universe that held their first characters in it.
Yeah. Do you think ever you would go back and explore her some more? Or do you really feel like this is the end for Simone's story from your point of view?
Well, never say never. I certainly don't know that I'll ever be able to stop writing about people in their relationship to Lake Superior. But I don't know what else I could tell. She hasn't come tapping on my shoulder recently to say, hey, so we'll see.
If she does tap on your shoulder, please let me know. I'm just really curious about that. I want to know. Now, because I love this book so much, I'm just kind of curious, what do you hope readers take away from this novel?
You know, that's such a good question, and I'm glad you ask it. Although I sometimes find it a little difficult because it feels presumptuous for me to tell readers, well, here's what I want you to learn. But just, I really, really hope that people perhaps look at the people around them a little differently, that everybody still has the opportunity to change and grow. We're all the main characters in our own stories. And so something that might look mean or counterintuitive to you might be because they're a different person than you are. And to give each other a little bit of grace. The community, I mean, one of the themes in the book is that Thunder Bay is really a small town, and it really is. My husband taught high school English for a long time, and so he had a bunch of kids move through his classes, and each of them had at least 2 parents, and so that's thousands of people. And you can't really talk about someone without knowing for sure that you're talking to their second cousin. We're all connected in ways that we don't maybe understand and aren't fully aware of. And that can work for us, I think, or against us. And also, I mean, just the basics of Simone, what stories are you telling yourself that maybe aren't serving you as well as they could anymore? What can you rethink to make your life a little bit more the way you would like for it to be? And, you know, if a reader just spends time reading the book and comes away having been entertained for a while or moved to talk about it with someone else, that's really plenty. I would be really happy if people just read it and enjoy themselves.
Yeah, so I would like to recommend to people, this is a great book to buddy read. Again, there are so many layers to it. So I think a buddy read or a book club, I would really highly recommend that, because I wish when I read it that somebody had been reading it along with me as well, because I think there is so much in the story and these, as I said, these 3 complex characters. I love that. So now you did kind of allude to something that you've got something coming in the future. So I was just curious, you know, what are you working on? What is it, if you can talk about it, and when can we expect, hopefully, to see it?
Well, I'm working on a novel. It's about islands and maps and land ownership and people who are owned by the land also. And there's a little also cross-border. I mean, as an American who has become a Canadian and is still a dual citizen and is pulled apart by things happening in both countries, there's a little bit of that in it as well. And it's a novel. I hope to see it, a really, really, really good draft of it by the end of 2024. So, like I said, I'm a little bit of a slow writer, and I'm working on it though. And in addition to that, I always try to keep writing short fiction and like prose poems, almost short nonfiction really is what I'm working on now, just to capture moments of a day or pay attention, to remind myself to pay attention to things. And there's so many people doing interesting things with flash fiction and flash nonfiction, or memoirs that are told in brief stories that seem unrelated, and then suddenly they turn out to be related after all. So I think that's really interesting. So I'm just trying my hand at reminding myself of what's around me and the beauty around me.
Now, are those things, that flash fiction, that you would like to see published at some point, or is that just for your own writing and your own talent and creativity?
Well, it does push my creativity because I do tend to be a longer writer, but I would love to see some of it published. I've had a 100-word story published. It came out, I guess, about a year ago. And there's other, yeah, I mean, I someday I would like to see some of it in print and maybe a collection. Who knows? I'm trying not to limit myself, but I really don't know very much about poetry, and I keep butting up against poetry.
Mhm.
How is flash fiction or flash nonfiction different from a lyric poem or a prose poem? And so it's right now it's kind of all of the things that I'm learning about still. But I hope someday that there would be a way for me to share some of that work about, most of it is about Northwestern Ontario or Lake Superior, or
Ooh.
what it's like to come here after living elsewhere for so long. So I hope there's a place to share that at some point.
That sounds fascinating. I would really be interested in that. So I hope that does come to fruition in the future. I really do. Now, my last question is, what are you currently reading?
Well, I recently posted online about Hollay Ghadery's debut poetry collection, Rebellion Box, because, as I said, I don't know much about poetry, but I am trying to read more of it. And I just found it so interesting. I knew her work from her memoir, Fuse, which came out during the pandemic. And it's so honest and almost searingly honest. And she writes about identity as a biracial woman. She talks about mental health. And in this Rebellion Box, they talk about, her poems are about being a mother and being a daughter, and from all the perspectives that you can take in that relationship. And that's just so fascinating to me. So I really have enjoyed that. And I find it, again, it's very accessible. Much of it has been published in journals, and she illuminates that in the back, and then talks also about some of the inspiration for each individual poem. And that's really helpful. It's almost like a little study guide for an intro to poetry class. So I really enjoyed that. And I'm looking forward to her short story collection also coming out this fall.
Is that the Widow Fantasies?
Yes, that's Flash too.
Yeah. It's funny because Tara and I are big fans of Hollay's, and so
Mm-hmm.
I've read Fuse and interviewed her. After I read Fuse, I loved it so much, and then I have read Rebellion Box, and I actually have a copy of an early copy of Widow Fantasies, and I'm really enjoying that as well. So yes,
Oh,
I would highly recommend if everybody out there, if anyone out there has yet to read Hollay, again, I'll put it in the show notes, but check out her writing. That is the thing about her. She is honest. She is so
mm-hmm.
honest about her life and within her writing. She's pretty amazing.
And if I could just plug one other book that I enjoyed so much.
Sure.
During the pandemic, a Saskatchewan writer named Leona Theis put out a novel. And it's one of those, is it a novel or is it short stories? But it's really a novel in short stories. And it's one of the few that I have actually thought that about. And it's called If Sylvie Had 9 Lives. And she takes a short story about a woman who is at an inflection point in her life. She's deciding to get married or not. And then she spins out different futures for Sylvie in short pieces from that point. And I can't stop thinking about it, in part because I found the character of Sylvie to be so true. All the different choices that Sylvie made. So it's kind of like that Gwyneth Paltrow movie, Sliding Doors. But so she gets married, or she doesn't get married, or she has a child, or she doesn't have a child, that particular child at that time. And it subtly changes her outlook on life, her abilities to believe in herself. And it's so interesting as almost a meditation on how important the choices that we make really are. And the other thing I really loved about it was all of them were potential futures for Sylvie. And I could never pick which one I thought was the best one or the one I wish she'd taken, because they all had pros and cons.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot to think about again. And I was so, it came out during the pandemic, and I just thought so many books got lost during those lockdown years.
Okay, I'm 100% going to check that one out, because that is exact. I think about that a lot, about the road not taken and
Mm-hmm.
what your life could look like if oh my gosh. So this sounds totally like a book I would love.
And the language is beautiful. She's also a poet, so it's amazing.
Wow. Okay, well, I'm going to check that one out. Again, everybody, it'll be in the show notes. So, Marion, I just want to thank you so much. I loved Making Up the Gods. I cannot wait to see what you write in the future. And thank you so much for coming and talking to us. And I hope that when the next book comes out, you'll come back again.
I would love to. And I love the way you say when my next book comes out, because that's what I'm going for. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on our bookish journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing Canada Reads American Style wherever you listen. You can connect with the podcast and Rebecca on Instagram at Canada Reads American Style, and with Tara at On a Branch Reads. Until next time, keep reading.